What would you do if city officials showed up tomorrow demanding you abandon everything you've built? That's exactly what happened to Carla when developers targeted her beloved bowling alley for demolition. She had two choices: walk away quietly or fight back against impossible odds. Most people would have given up, but Carla had been preparing for this moment in ways no one could have predicted. The paperwork she filed years earlier was about to become the most powerful weapon in the room, and it cost her less than $50 to file. 7 a.m. sharp, the bulldozers rolled up like an army. Construction crews jumped out of trucks. City officials straightened their ties. And right in the middle of it all stood Gary Crane, the city attorney who had a reputation for clearing development obstacles quickly. He had legal papers in one hand and a smile that said the game was already over. Picture this scene: a 67-year-old woman in her bowling alley apron facing down a crowd of suits and hard hats. They thought they'd already won. The emergency eviction notice gave Carla very short notice to pack up and get out. But something about her calm face didn't match the panic everyone expected to see. Gary waved those legal papers like a victory flag. Reporters gathered around as he explained how this outdated building would become luxury condos that would benefit the entire community. His voice carried that confident tone of someone who'd done this dance many times before. Small business owners usually crumbled at this point. The neighbors started gathering on the sidewalk. Some were crying, others looked angry. This bowling alley had hosted their kids' birthday parties, their first dates, their retirement celebrations. 3 generations of families had memories soaked into those worn wooden lanes. But Carla just stood there with her arms crossed. She had this tiny smile that made Gary's confident speech stumble for just a second. You could see him glance at her, wondering why she wasn't breaking down or storming off like the others usually did. The construction foreman started marking where the wrecking ball would hit first. Bright orange spray paint on the brick walls. He expected Carla to crack when she saw those demolition marks. Most people do. That's when the reality hits them. Instead, Carla walked back inside her bowling alley. The crowd watched through the windows as she moved calmly between the lanes. Gary kept talking to the reporters, but his eyes followed her movement. Something felt different about this one. When Carla came back outside, she carried something that made the entire crowd go silent. A manila folder. Nothing fancy, just a regular office folder that looked like it had been sitting in a filing cabinet for years. But the way she held it made everyone stop what they were doing. Gary's voice trailed off mid-sentence. The construction foreman stopped spraying his orange marks. Even the reporters sensed that something was about to shift in a way nobody had planned for. You could feel the tension change in the air. That manila folder contained something none of these powerful people saw coming. Not the developers who'd spent months planning this demolition. Not Gary Crane with all his legal expertise. Not the city officials who'd rubber-stamped the eviction order. None of them knew what was about to hit them. I wasn't shaking because I'd done homework most people never do. While everyone thought I was just playing at being a business owner, I was building something that would make this entire confrontation irrelevant. The documents in that folder represented years of patient work, research that nobody noticed. Phone calls that seemed unimportant, trips to dusty offices that looked like bureaucratic dead ends. What they didn't know was how those years of small moves had led to this exact moment. Gary had run this same playbook dozens of times before. Find violations, stack fines, make fighting back so expensive that people just give up. He'd cleared out obstacles for development projects across the city. His reputation was built on making problems like me disappear quickly and quietly. Every form I'd filed, every expert I'd quietly consulted, every photograph I'd carefully documented. It was all leading to this manila folder that would flip his moment of triumph into public embarrassment. The neighbors who'd gathered to say goodbye to their bowling alley had no idea they were about to witness something incredible. This wasn't just about one stubborn old lady refusing to move. This was about what happens when preparation meets the right moment. You could see it in Gary's face when I opened that folder. His legal training was already telling him that whatever I was holding could be a problem. But his confidence in the system made him believe that no retired lunch lady could outmaneuver the entire city development machine. The construction crew stood frozen with their spray paint and measuring tools. The reporters started asking different questions. Even the city officials began shifting uncomfortably as they realized this wasn't going according to script. What happened next would prove that sometimes the best defense is preparation that nobody sees coming. Those documents didn't just protect one building. They were about to change how power worked in the entire neighborhood. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect. The manila folder that looked so ordinary was about to reveal years of strategic thinking that would make Gary's legal trap completely worthless. But the real lesson was just beginning, because what I had figured out was something that any property owner could learn. That smile on my face wasn't stubbornness, it was confidence built on homework that most people never think to do. While the developers were circling like sharks, I had been building armor they couldn't see. What I pulled out of that folder would prove that knowledge beats bullying every single time. But this showdown didn't start at 7 a.m. that morning. It started years earlier when my world fell apart in ways that would have destroyed most people. What I did next changed everything about how this story would end. For years earlier, my phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. The voice on the other end changed everything in 5 seconds. Tom had collapsed at his construction job. Massive heart attack. Gone before the paramedics could do anything. 64 years old, and just like that, my world ended. The funeral felt like watching someone else's life. 30 years of marriage disappeared into a hole in the ground. I'd spent 3 decades feeding kids as a school lunch lady. I knew how to handle crying children and scraped knees. But this emptiness that swallowed my house whole, I had no idea how to fix that. The silence hit me worst on Friday nights. For 20 years, Tom and I had driven to Murphy's bowling alley every week without fail. Lane 7 was our spot. Tom had proposed to me there in 1989. Getting down on one knee right next to the ball return. Every anniversary, we'd go back to Lane 7 and remember that moment. Now Friday nights stretched out like punishment. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that hurt to touch. I would sit in Tom's chair and stare at the wall until Saturday morning came to rescue me from the darkness. 6 months after the funeral, I heard Murphy talking to his regular customers. The old man was 73 and couldn't keep up with repairs anymore. The building needed everything. New furnace, updated electrical. The roof leaked every time it rained hard. Murphy was selling the place to whoever would take it off his hands. Something snapped into focus inside my head. This building held my marriage proposal, my anniversary celebrations, my kids' birthday parties. 3 generations of families had made memories between these walls. If Murphy sold to the wrong person, all of that would disappear forever. That's why I bought the alley, to save the place that held our life together. My friends thought grief had broken my brain. A retired lunch lady spending her life savings on a failing bowling alley? The building was falling apart. The neighborhood was changing. Young families were moving to newer developments with modern entertainment. Who bowls anymore when everyone has video games at home? But I saw something my friends missed. This wasn't just about 10 lanes and a snack bar. Murphy's bowling alley was the last place in the neighborhood where 3 generations still showed up together. Grandparents teaching grandkids how to keep score. Teenagers on first dates sharing nachos and nervous laughter. Retirement parties for people who'd worked the same job for 40 years. The day I signed those papers felt like jumping off a cliff. My savings account went from comfortable retirement to barely enough for emergencies. Murphy handed me the keys with tears in his eyes. He'd owned the place for 35 years and never thought anyone would care enough to keep it alive. That first night alone in the bowling alley, I made a promise to Tom's memory. This place would survive no matter what it took. The developers could come. The city could complicate things with inspections and permits. But I would not let the heart of this community die on my watch. What nobody knew was that I'd learned something important during those months of overwhelming grief. When your world falls apart, you discover what really matters. And what matters is protecting the places where people connect, where memories get made, where communities stay alive. The building needed more work than Murphy had admitted. The heating system died that first winter. Half the lane lights flickered like dying candles. The restrooms needed complete renovation. But every repair bill just made me more determined. I wasn't just fixing a business. I was preserving something irreplaceable. Local families started noticing the changes. Fresh paint on the walls, new scorecards at every lane. The snack bar actually had food that didn't taste like cardboard. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood that someone finally cared about Murphy's again. Friday nights became sacred again. But instead of sitting across from Tom in Lane 7, I was everywhere at once, taking food orders, helping kids with their bowling technique, listening to stories from customers who'd been coming here longer than I'd been alive. The emptiness in my chest started filling up with something new. The financial pressure was constant. Every month brought another stack of bills that made my stomach hurt. Insurance costs, utility payments, equipment repairs that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Some nights I lay awake wondering if my friends were right about me losing my mind. But then I'd see a grandfather teaching his grandson how to pick up a spare, or watch a group of teenagers celebrate someone's birthday with the same excitement I remembered from my own kids, or help an elderly couple celebrate their anniversary at the same table where they'd had their first date. Those moments made every sacrifice worth it. What I didn't realize was that buying Murphy's bowling alley had put me on a collision course with forces much bigger than broken heating systems and leaky roof. The neighborhood was changing in ways that would bring powerful people with bulldozers and legal papers. People who saw my building as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. The promise I'd made to Tom's memory was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. Because while I was learning how to run a business and rebuild a community gathering place, other people were making different plans for my corner lot. Plans that would force me to discover just how far I was willing to go to keep my word. But something else was happening during those late nights when I balanced the books and fixed broken equipment. Something that would prove that sometimes the most important battles are won long before anyone realizes there's going to be a fight. I started doing homework that most people never think to do. 3 nights a week, after closing the bowling alley, I drove to the public library with a notepad and reading glasses. The security guard got used to seeing this determined woman hunched over dusty city records until closing time. The local history section became my second home. I spread out property deeds, construction permits, and architectural surveys like a detective working a cold case. These weren't random documents. Every paper I touched was connected to my building in ways that most people would never think to explore. Here's what you need to know if you ever face something like this. Start at the local library and ask for building permits, old news clippings, and property records. Most libraries keep decades of local documents that nobody ever looks at. The librarians know exactly where to find them. That's when I discovered something incredible. Archival records and old local papers showed decades of community events, meetings, and public use. My building wasn't just old, it had been part of something much bigger than I'd realized. The construction details made my pulse race. Original architectural plans and news clippings revealed materials and techniques that could qualify for historical protection under federal law. These weren't just interesting facts, they were potential legal ammunition. But the real treasure was what had happened inside those walls over the decades. I found documentation showing community meetings, fundraisers, and disaster relief efforts. Different groups had used this space for everything from voter registration to emergency shelter. The bowling alley had been neutral ground where the neighborhood came together. Every document I copied revealed another layer of community history. High school fundraisers, wedding receptions, funeral gatherings, political meetings. This building had hosted events that shaped 3 generations of families. It wasn't just a business. It was the unofficial town hall for an entire neighborhood. The librarian started saving me a table by the microfilm machine. This quiet woman showed up every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday with the same focused energy. I took notes in neat handwriting. I made copies of everything. I asked smart questions about where to find specific records. I learned that historical preservation wasn't about age alone. Buildings needed to prove significant community impact. They had to demonstrate architectural importance. Most critically, they needed documentation that government agencies could verify and approve. I was building a legal case without realizing it. The research became addictive. Every new document answered one question and raised 5 others. Who designed the original lighting system? Which local families attended community events here? How many different organizations had used this space over the decades? The answers painted a picture of irreplaceable cultural significance. Phone calls to retired city employees filled in missing pieces. I started consulting preservation experts without telling anyone why. I called university professors who specialized in community development. I spoke with architects who understood federal construction standards from earlier decades. Each conversation added professional credibility to my growing file of evidence. 6 months of research produced a portfolio that looked like a graduate thesis. Photographs showing architectural details, newspaper articles documenting community events, expert opinions about construction technique, government records proving the building's history, insurance surveys detailing original materials. This wasn't amateur detective work anymore. The portfolio filled 3 binders organized by category: historical significance, architectural importance, community impact, construction standards. Each section contained original documents, professional analysis, and photographic evidence. Any preservation society would have been proud to submit this research, but knowing the history was only half the battle. I discovered that historical protection required official government designation. Buildings don't automatically qualify for landmark status just because they're old or important. Someone has to file applications. Someone has to push paperwork through bureaucratic systems. Someone has to make it official. The application process looked complicated but not impossible. Federal and state agencies had clear requirements for historical designation. The paperwork was extensive but straightforward. Most importantly, the process was designed for regular citizens who cared about preserving community landmarks. Here's what made me different from most people facing these situations. I started researching before anyone threatened my building. I documented everything while I had time to be thorough. I built relationships with experts before I needed their help. I prepared for battles that hadn't started yet. Every expert I consulted said the same thing. My building qualified for historical protection under multiple criteria. The architecture was significant. The community impact was documented. The construction history was undeniable. The only question was whether someone would file the proper applications. This research wasn't just about saving one building. I was learning how historical preservation worked as a legal strategy, how communities could protect important places from developers, how regular citizens could use government systems to preserve what mattered most to them. The manila folder that would later shock Gary Crane and stop those bulldozers was born in this library research. Every late night studying documents, every phone call to preservation experts, every carefully organized piece of evidence. I was building armor that nobody could see. What I didn't know was how perfectly my timing would work out. Those months of patient research were about to collide with a development threat that would test everything I'd learned. The question wasn't whether my building deserved protection. The question was whether I could make it official before the bulldozers showed up. But first, I had to do something that most people never think of until it's too late. Something that would turn all this research into actual legal protection. Something that required walking into a government office with a stack of papers and hoping the system would work the way it was supposed to. The hardest part wasn't the research. It was what came next. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I walked into the city planning office carrying a manila envelope that would change everything. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up from her computer screen. Just another elderly woman with questions about permits or zoning. The clerk had seen dozens like me that week alone. What that clerk didn't realize was that I'd spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment. Every form filled out in perfect handwriting. Every document organized in precise order. Every requirement checked and double-checked against the official guidelines I'd memorized from cover to cover. The application in that envelope was detailed and comprehensive. Architectural photographs taken from multiple angles, historical records going back decades, professional analysis from preservation experts, community testimonials from families who'd been coming to the bowling alley for years. This wasn't amateur paperwork. This was a legal case built like a fortress. I'd hired a preservation consultant with my own money. Money I could barely afford, but the investment was worth it. The consultant reviewed every page, corrected formatting errors, and added technical language that government reviewers would recognize and respect. Professional presentation matters when you're asking bureaucrats to protect your building. The historical documentation filled multiple pages by itself. Original construction permits from the post-war era. Newspaper clippings showing community events hosted in the building. Insurance surveys detailing architectural elements that qualified for federal protection. Government records proving the building's significance to neighborhood development over decades. Community support filled another section. Letters from 3 generations of families explaining what the bowling alley meant to their lives. Testimonials from local business owners who'd watched the building anchor the neighborhood through economic changes. Statements from retired city employees who remembered when the bowling alley served as a community gathering place during local emergencies. The architectural analysis was the strongest part. Professional photographs showing construction techniques from earlier decades. Expert opinions about materials that met federal standards for historical significance. Detailed measurements of structural elements that preservation agencies would need to verify and approve. This section alone proved the building qualified for protection under multiple criteria. I approached the counter with the confidence of someone who'd done her homework. The clerk handed me the standard forms for landmark applications. I smiled and explained I'd already completed everything. The envelope contained original documents, certified copies, professional photographs, and the required filing fee in exact change. The clerk's expression shifted from bored routine to mild surprise. Most people showed up with half-finished paperwork and questions about basic requirements. My application was complete, organized, and ready for immediate processing. The clerk stamped the filing date and handed me an official receipt. That receipt was the most important piece of paper I'd ever held. It proved I'd filed for historic landmark designation before anyone tried to demolish my building. The date stamp started a formal legal process that would make demolition much harder if the designation went through. If you're going to try this, get help from a preservation professional, and make copies of everything. File for historic or landmark status with your local planning office. Requirements and names vary by city, so check your local planning office first. Walking out of that office, I knew I'd just started something that wouldn't be resolved for years. Historic landmark applications move through government systems slowly. Reviews by planning departments. Evaluations by preservation committees. Public hearings where communities can voice support or opposition. Municipal review can take months or years depending on the city's priorities and resources. For 3 years, that application moved through the system like a ghost. Planning department reviews. Committee evaluations. Requests for additional documentation that I promptly provided. I attended every meeting where my application was discussed. I answered every question from city officials who seemed surprised by my thoroughness. The process taught me something crucial about fighting powerful people. Most battles are won or lost long before anyone realizes there's going to be a fight. While other property owners waited until developers showed up with eviction notices, I was building legal protection that nobody could see. I learned that patience is a weapon when used correctly. Every month that application stayed pending was another month of protection building around my bowling alley. Every bureaucratic delay was actually working in my favor. The system's slowness became my advantage against people who expected quick victories. The landmark application created legal complexity that developers hate dealing with. Properties under review for historic designation can't be demolished without extensive additional approvals. The process becomes expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Most developers move on to easier targets rather than fight lengthy preservation battles. I discovered the most important lesson in fighting powerful people. Sometimes the best move is the one they never see coming. While developers were focused on zoning laws and city council politics, I was building federal-level protection through historic preservation. Different game, different rules, different outcome. The application process revealed how much power regular citizens actually have when they understand the system. Government agencies exist to serve communities, not just developers. But you have to know which forms to file, which deadlines to meet, which experts to consult. Knowledge becomes leverage when applied correctly. 3 years of waiting taught me that timing matters more than force. My application would be approved or denied based on merit, not politics. But when that decision came would depend on factors nobody could predict. Changes in city leadership, shifts in development pressure, community attention focused on preservation issues. What I couldn't predict was how perfectly my timing would work out. Those 3 years of bureaucratic delays were about to collide with forces I hadn't seen coming yet. The manila folder that would eventually stop bulldozers was born in this quiet government office where nobody paid attention to one elderly woman filing paperwork. The protection was building slowly through government channels that most people never think to monitor. My bowling alley looked the same from the outside. Same neon sign, same cracked parking lot, same Friday night regulars rolling strikes and spares. But something had changed in ways that wouldn't become visible for years. I'd created a legal timeline that would matter when the pressure started building. When powerful people decided my corner lot was worth more empty than occupied. What I didn't know was that other people were already making plans for my building. Plans that would test everything I'd learned about preparation, patience, and fighting smarter instead of harder. 3 years into running the bowling alley, strange men in expensive suits started showing up during the lunch rush. They claimed to be consultants interested in the neighborhood, but their questions weren't about community programs or family bowling league. They wanted to know about property values, zoning classifications, and building permits. Every question felt like someone sizing up prey. I served them coffee and smiled while they measured walls with fancy laser devices. I watched them take photographs of structural beams and exit signs. I listened to them discuss square footage and development potential in voices they thought were quiet enough. Never once did I let on that I knew exactly what they were planning. The real estate market was heating up across the city. Neighborhoods that had been ignored for decades were suddenly attracting developer attention. Young professionals wanted walkable communities close to downtown. They had money to spend and developers were racing to build places for them to spend it. My corner lot was perfect for their plans. Large enough for a multi-story condo building. Walking distance to restaurants and office buildings downtown. Currently occupied by what they saw as a failing business run by an elderly woman who probably didn't understand modern economics. In their minds, this was easy money waiting to be claimed. The offers kept coming, each higher, each with quiet pressure: sell now or you'll be forced later. The first came through a real estate agent who smiled too much, double what I'd paid for the building just 3 years earlier. When I said no, he looked confused. Most elderly business owners jumped at offers like this. 2 weeks later, a different agent called with a better offer, triple what I'd paid. Then another call with an even higher number. Each conversation followed the same script. The neighborhood was changing. Property taxes would increase. Competition from newer entertainment venues would hurt my business. Selling now made financial sense for someone my age. The amounts being offered made my neighbors gasp in disbelief. Some of them started looking at their own properties differently. If a rundown bowling alley was worth that much money, What could they get for their houses? The developers were smart about creating buzz that made the whole neighborhood feel like they were sitting on hidden treasure. But every generous offer came with the same underlying message. Take the money now while it's still available. Because if you don't sell voluntarily, we'll find another way to get what we want. The threats weren't spoken directly, but they hung in the air like smoke from a fire you couldn't see yet. I kept saying no to every offer. I kept serving my regular customers their Friday night nachos and birthday cake. I kept pretending I was just a stubborn old lady who didn't understand business. Let them think I was making emotional decisions based on sentimental attachment to my dead husband's memory. If you're approached with a buyout, document everything, get a second opinion, and check public records about your property. Don't sign the first paper. I was already doing this without realizing how important it would become. Every conversation got written down. Every letter got filed. Every agent's business card went into my growing folder of evidence. The developers started getting frustrated with my refusal to be reasonable. They'd budgeted time and money for this acquisition. Their construction timeline depended on clearing this lot by a specific date. My stubbornness was becoming expensive for people who weren't used to delays from small business owners. Phone calls became more frequent and more aggressive. Letters arrived with legal letterhead explaining my options in language designed to sound official and intimidating. The same real estate agents who'd been friendly and patient started using words like market forces and inevitable development pressure. What the developers didn't understand was that I'd been expecting them for months. I'd watched similar patterns play out across other neighborhoods in the city. Consultants asking questions, generous offers followed by pressure tactics. Small businesses disappearing to make room for luxury housing that longtime residents couldn't afford. I'd also been preparing for this fight in ways that none of these suit-wearing consultants could imagine. While they were measuring walls and calculating square footage, I was building legal protection they couldn't see. My manila folder of historical documents was growing thicker with evidence that would make their development plans much more complicated. The developers operated on predictable timelines. They needed to secure property, get permits approved, and start construction within narrow windows that maximized profit margins. Delays cost money. Legal complications cost even more money. Their business model depended on quick acquisitions from property owners who didn't fight back effectively. I understood something about power that most people miss. The developers looked strong because they had money and lawyers and political connections, but their strength was actually weakness disguised as confidence. They needed my property more than I needed their money. That desperation would eventually force them to reveal their real strategy. The pressure campaign escalated over 6 months. More agents calling with higher offers. Letters from law firms explaining my legal obligations as a property owner. Surprise visits from city inspectors who found violations that had been ignored for decades. Each tactic was designed to make fighting back seem hopeless and expensive, but I had learned patience during those long months of grief after Tom died. I knew how to wait for the right moment, while other people made mistakes based on impatience and overconfidence. Every aggressive move the developers made was actually giving me more information about their timeline and their weaknesses. The polite phase was ending. I could feel it in the tone of the phone calls. The language in the letters was getting sharper. The inspectors were finding problems that hadn't existed the week before. Someone was losing patience with my refusal to cooperate. They thought they had a timeline. They didn't know about the folder. Not yet. That's when the developers brought in their secret weapon. Gary Crane walked into City Hall like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. As the city attorney who specialized in clearing obstacles for development projects, Gary had a reputation for making small business problems disappear fast. This wasn't Gary's first rodeo with stubborn property owners. Over 15 years, he'd perfected a system that worked like clockwork. Find violations, stack fines, make fighting back so expensive that people just gave up and took whatever money was still on the table. The beauty of his approach was that everything looked completely legal and above board. Gary's strategy was simple but brutal. Every building has violations if you look hard enough. Codes change over decades. Safety requirements get updated. Permit requirements shift with new city ordinances. What was perfectly legal in 1952 might not meet current standards. And Gary knew exactly where to look for problems that would stick in court. The first surprise inspection hit my bowling alley on a Tuesday morning at 8 sharp. Gary arrived with a clipboard full of violation forms already half filled out. He cited me for outdated fire extinguishers that were 6 months past their inspection date, insufficient parking signage that didn't meet current visibility requirements, emergency exit lighting that was too dim by modern safety standards. Each violation came with a fine. Each fine had a deadline for payment or appeal. Gary made sure the paperwork was confusing enough to trip up anyone who tried to respond without hiring expensive legal help. The violation notices used technical language about municipal codes and safety regulations. Most people got overwhelmed and just paid rather than fight. The fines started small: $50 for the fire extinguisher issue, $75 for the parking signs, $100 for the exit lighting. Gary knew that small amounts felt manageable at first. People would pay the initial fines while they figured out how to fix the underlying problems. That's when the real trap would spring, because fixing one violation often revealed 3 more. Upgrading the exit lighting required electrical work that revealed wiring that didn't meet current codes. Replacing the parking signs meant repainting lines that were now the wrong width. Installing new fire extinguishers required mounting brackets that needed permits for wall modifications. Gary had done this dance dozens of times before. Small business owners would panic when they saw how expensive compliance would be. They'd hire lawyers who charged hundreds of dollars an hour to explain municipal code requirements. The legal bills would pile up faster than the violation fines. Eventually, people would surrender to save whatever money they had left. What would most people do? Panic, call a lawyer, pay to stop the clock. I did something else. Something about my responses puzzled Gary from the start. Every fine was paid on time. Every appeal was filed correctly with all the required documentation. Every deadline was met without the panic phone calls he usually got from overwhelmed business owners asking for extensions. Here's what I learned: document every notice, save receipts, and file written responses. Institutions can use technical rules to pressure people. That's why documentation and timely appeals matter. I kept copies of everything. I photographed violations before and after making corrections. I maintained a paper trail that would make any appeals court happy. The fire extinguisher violation was resolved within a week. I had the equipment inspected, certified, and properly mounted with all the correct paperwork filed at City Hall. The parking signs were replaced and repainted to exact specifications Gary hadn't expected me to understand. The exit lighting was upgraded with a permit application that included detailed electrical schematic. Gary increased the pressure with more inspections. He found violations in the restroom accessibility features that would require expensive renovations. The kitchen equipment needed updated ventilation systems to meet current health department standards. The bowling lane surfaces had wear patterns that could be classified as safety hazards under strict interpretation of recreation facility codes. Each new violation brought higher fines and more complex requirements. Gary was confident that I would eventually crack under the mounting costs and bureaucratic complexity. The total bill for bringing the building into full compliance was approaching serious money. Most small business owners would have given up by now. Instead, I kept responding like someone who'd been preparing for this fight. I hired the right contractors. I filed the correct permits. I scheduled the required inspections. I paid every fine without complaint and fixed every problem Gary identified. My responses were too organized, too efficient, too knowledgeable for someone who should have been overwhelmed. Gary's confidence started cracking when he realized this lunch lady was playing by rules he didn't think I knew existed. I understood municipal codes better than most property developers. I had relationships with contractors who could handle complex compliance issues. I responded to legal documents like someone who'd been studying city regulations for years. The violation notices that usually sent people into panic spirals barely seemed to faze me. I'd read them carefully, make notes in the margins, and develop action plans that addressed not just the immediate problems but potential future issues Gary might raise. I was staying 3 steps ahead of his enforcement strategy. Worse, I was documenting everything. Gary started to worry that his aggressive enforcement might look like harassment if anyone decided to investigate. The other business owners in the neighborhood were watching how I handled Gary's pressure campaign. They saw my methodical responses to violations that would have destroyed their own operations. Word was spreading that the elderly woman running the bowling alley knew how to fight City Hall and win. That kind of reputation made Gary's job harder in other cases. But Gary had one final card to play, the ultimate weapon that had never failed him in 15 years of clearing obstacles for developers. A violation so serious and so immediate that it would bypass all the normal appeals processes and force me to shut down immediately. What Gary didn't know was that his final move would force me to reveal the secret weapon I'd been building for 3 years. The moment he thought would be his greatest victory was about to become something else entirely. Gary's final move was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. He'd spent weeks digging through 70 years of city records looking for the perfect trap. He argued there were permit issues and filed emergency orders that demanded immediate action. The eviction notice landed on my door at 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Short notice to vacate the premises. All business operations must cease immediately. Demolition was scheduled to begin the following Monday. The timeline was designed to prevent any meaningful legal response. Gary had learned that speed kills opposition. Give people enough time to think, and they might find lawyers who know how to fight back. Give them enough time to organize, and communities might rally around threatened businesses. But hit them with emergency orders that expire quickly, and most people just panic and comply. Local news picked up the story that afternoon. The reporters framed it exactly the way Gary wanted. Progress versus nostalgia. Modern housing needs versus outdated entertainment. The kind of narrative that usually favors developers who create jobs and tax revenue over small business owners who represent the past. Gary held a press conference outside the bowling alley at 4 p.m. He wore his best suit and practiced his concerned citizen expression. The cameras rolled while he explained how this outdated facility would be replaced by affordable housing that would benefit the entire community. The speech hit every talking point Gary had used successfully in other neighborhoods. Public safety concerns about aging infrastructure, economic development opportunities from modern construction, community benefits from increased property values, and tax revenue. He made it sound like closing the bowling alley was actually helping the people who bowled there. Gary was so confident in his legal trap that he invited cameras to document my final defeat. He wanted footage of the moment when I realized that all my stubborn resistance had been pointless. The image of a defeated elderly woman walking away from her failed business would send a clear message to other property owners who might consider fighting similar battles. The reporters asked Gary about appeals processes and community concerns. He explained that emergency safety orders couldn't be delayed by lengthy legal procedures. Appeals could be filed, but they wouldn't stop the demolition while violations remained unresolved. What Gary didn't mention was the timing pressure from his developer clients. Their construction loans had interest rates that made delays expensive. Their building permits for the condo project would expire if ground wasn't broken within 60 days. The entire financial structure of their development plan depended on clearing this lot immediately. I watched Gary's press conference from inside the bowling alley. My regular customers had gathered around the old television above the snack bar. Some were crying. Others were angry about the way Gary made their community gathering place sound like a public menace. But I just stood there with that same calm expression that had puzzled everyone for months. The construction crews were already positioning equipment in the parking lot. Yellow caution tape marked the demolition zone. Orange spray paint outlined where the wrecking ball would hit first. Gary had orchestrated the whole show to create an atmosphere of inevitable destruction. But what Gary didn't know was that his aggressive timeline had just triggered something that could change everything. In some jurisdictions, preservation rules can trigger expedited reviews when demolition is imminent. My 3-year wait for historic designation approval was about to end in ways that would shock everyone watching Gary's confident press conference. Local laws differ. These strategies work differently depending on where you live. But that manila folder I'd been carrying contained more than sentimental documents and community photos. It held paperwork that could make Gary's emergency demolition order worthless. The city planning office had received something important for my historic landmark application just 3 days earlier. The timing was pure bureaucratic coincidence. But preservation laws can be clear about buildings under demolition threat. Once protection is officially granted, emergency destruction orders can become invalid regardless of local safety claims. Gary had spent weeks building his perfect legal trap, but he'd made one critical mistake. He never checked preservation databases. He never researched whether the building had any protection beyond local zoning laws. He assumed that one elderly woman running a failing bowling alley couldn't possibly have legal weapons powerful enough to stop his carefully planned demolition. That manila folder represented 3 years of patient preparation colliding with Gary's impatient timeline. Every document I'd filed, every expert consultation I'd quietly arranged, every photograph and historical record I'd carefully organized. All of it was about to prove that knowledge beats bullying when timing works in your favor. The cameras Gary had invited to document my defeat were about to capture something completely different. The moment when a retired lunch lady's homework assignment could turn a city attorney's moment of triumph into something else entirely. The construction crews kept marking demolition points with their orange spray paint. The reporters kept scribbling notes about community development and progress. Gary kept waving his eviction papers like victory was already guaranteed. None of them knew what was coming next. The demolition clock was ticking. But I had one last thing no one had expected. That manila folder contained a single sheet of official letterhead that would change everything. The document looked ordinary at first glance. Standard government paper with official seals and bureaucratic language. But the date at the top made Gary's stomach drop. 3 days earlier, final approval of historic landmark designation for 429 Maple Street, processed after 3 years in bureaucratic limbo. The timing was pure coincidence, but it couldn't have been more perfect. I walked over and handed Gary the landmark certificate without saying a word. His confident smile froze on his face. The cameras captured everything. His legal expertise was telling him exactly what this document meant for his carefully planned eviction. The reporters sensed something had changed, but didn't understand what they were witnessing yet. The newly issued landmark certificate created immediate legal obstacles that made demolition impossible, at least for now. Gary knew this fact better than most people. His legal training included property law and historic preservation regulations. The moment he read that letterhead, his brain started calculating how badly this would destroy his demolition timeline. The construction foreman stopped marking walls with his spray paint. He'd seen enough government paperwork in 30 years of demolition work to recognize when a job gets complicated. The crew started looking around nervously. Nobody wanted to be responsible for destroying a federally protected building by accident. Gary's hands were shaking slightly as he read the historic designation approval. Federal and state laws protecting landmarks override local zoning disputes. His clever legal trap about permit issues had just become completely worthless. Properties with official historic protection require extensive additional review processes, public hearings, and appeals that can take years to resolve. The reporters started asking different questions. Why hadn't the city attorney checked for historic designations before filing demolition orders? What did this mean for the development project? How long had I been working on landmark approval? Gary found himself answering questions he hadn't prepared for. The developer's lawyer went pale when he saw the document. His clients had invested months of planning and thousands of dollars in permit applications. The construction timeline was locked to loan agreements with expensive interest rates. This historic designation would delay everything by years if they couldn't find a way around the new legal requirements. But there was no quick way around federal historic protection. The building was now officially recognized as significant to American community development history. The architectural elements qualified under multiple preservation criteria. The community impact was documented in government records. No local official could override that protection without extensive legal processes. The crowd of neighbors who'd gathered to say goodbye to their bowling alley suddenly realized they were witnessing something incredible. This wasn't just about one stubborn old lady refusing to move. I had spent 3 years quietly building an unbreakable legal shield while everyone thought I was just being sentimental. Gary tried to maintain his composure for the cameras. He explained that the city would need to review this new information and determine how it affected the demolition order. But his voice lacked the confidence he'd shown an hour earlier. Every reporter in the crowd could hear that something fundamental had changed. The construction crew started packing up their equipment without being told. Union workers don't mess around with federal preservation laws. The liability issues alone could shut down their company. The orange spray paint marks they'd made on the walls looked ridiculous now that demolition was impossible. I stood there with that same calm expression I'd worn all morning. I wasn't gloating or celebrating. I looked like someone who'd been expecting this moment for years, which, it turned out, I had been. The manila folder contained 3 years of patient preparation finally paying off. In one moment, the power dynamic flipped completely. The developers' bulldozers had to retreat from the parking lot. Gary's eviction notice was legally meaningless. The emergency demolition order couldn't override federal historic protection. All the pressure tactics and legal manipulation had been neutralized by one document. The reporters started asking me how I'd known to apply for historic designation. When had I started the process? How had I gathered the evidence needed for approval? My answers revealed a level of strategic thinking that nobody had expected from a retired lunch lady. Gary realized he was standing in front of cameras looking like he'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated. His reputation was built on making problems disappear quickly. This public failure would follow him for years. The developers who'd hired him were not going to be happy about this outcome. The neighborhood families watching this confrontation started understanding what they'd almost lost. Their bowling alley wasn't just a business. It was officially recognized as part of American history. The place where their kids had birthday parties was now protected by the same laws that preserve national monuments. But the real lesson was just beginning to sink in for everyone watching this showdown. I had used patience, research, and preparation to defeat people with money, lawyers, and political connections. I'd played by rules that my opponents didn't even know existed. Federal historic preservation laws exist to protect exactly these kinds of community gathering places. But most people never learn how to use those protections. They wait until bulldozers show up to start fighting. By then it's too late to file applications or gather the evidence needed for approval. The real win was preparation, documentation, expert support, and filing forms before a crisis. I started building legal protection years before anyone threatened my building. I documented everything while I had time to be thorough. I consulted experts before I needed their help in a crisis. The manila folder that had seemed so ordinary contained the kind of homework that changes everything, not just for one bowling alley, but for how communities can protect the places that matter most to them. What nobody expected was how quickly word would spread about what had just happened. The cameras had captured everything. The story was already moving through the neighborhood in ways that would change what came next. By that evening, the parking lot filled with people who'd driven across town just to bowl where history happened. Everyone wanted to see the woman who'd made Gary Crane look like an amateur on live television. Families lined up at lanes that used to sit empty on Friday nights. But this wasn't just about curiosity seekers taking selfies. Small business owners started showing up with notebooks and serious questions. The owner of the corner deli wanted to know how I had researched my building's history. The woman who ran the used bookstore asked about filing deadlines for historic applications. Word was getting out that someone had figured out how to beat the system. Gary wasn't done fighting. Losing on camera had bruised more than his ego. His reputation with the development crowd was taking hits. Phone calls from angry clients who'd expected quick results. Whispered conversations at city council meetings about whether Gary was losing his touch. He needed to prove that one lucky victory didn't make me untouchable. The historic designation protected the building from demolition. But Gary pushed back through inspections and tax pressure. Health inspections that happened every 2 weeks instead of twice a year. Tax assessments that mysteriously increased overnight. Permit requirements for routine repairs that used to take one form now needed multiple approvals. Gary was playing a longer game now. Make running the business so expensive and complicated that I would eventually surrender and sell to someone who'd tear down the building legally. Historic protection had loopholes if you knew where to look and had patience for bureaucratic warfare. What changed everything was watching neighbors who'd taken the bowling alley for granted suddenly understand what they'd almost lost. Mrs. Patterson from 3 blocks over had met her husband on Lane 5 in 1967. The Rodriguez family had celebrated 3 generations of birthdays at the same corner table. These weren't just customers anymore. They were people fighting for their own memories. Local families started organizing like they were planning military campaigns. They organized fundraisers for the new heating system I couldn't afford. Volunteer crews of high school kids showed up Saturday mornings to clean gutters and paint walls. They started a petition supporting the bowling alley and showed up at city meetings to voice their support. The Friday night leagues went from half-empty to packed with people who'd never bowled before but wanted to support the fight. The teenagers surprised everyone. Kids who spent most of their time staring at phones suddenly cared about preserving something their grandparents built. They created social media accounts for the bowling alley, made videos explaining why community spaces matter, turned my victory into content that reached way beyond the neighborhood. The story went viral in ways nobody expected, not because of dramatic legal battles or David versus Goliath headlines, but because people across the country were losing their own community gathering places to developers who saw only dollar signs where families saw irreplaceable memories. My manila folder became a symbol of what regular people could accomplish with patience and homework. Customers started driving from other cities to bowl where the lunch lady beat the lawyers. They bought t-shirts with my face on them, posted reviews online that brought even more people. Friday nights that used to bring in modest income were suddenly bringing in serious money. The business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in ways I had never imagined possible. But the real change happened when other property owners started asking me to teach them my research methods. On Sundays I showed them where to look at the library, which offices to call, and how to document oral histories. I taught them how to dig through dusty records and find historical significance in buildings they'd thought were just old and run down. The preservation consultant who'd helped me with my application started getting calls from across the state. Property owners who'd heard about the bowling alley victory wanted to know if their buildings qualified for historic protection. A movement was building around the idea that communities could fight back if they understood the rules. I discovered I had a talent for teaching people how to protect themselves. My manila folder method became a template that worked for different kinds of buildings. Churches facing closure, neighborhood bars threatened by gentrification, family restaurants losing leases to chain stores that paid higher rent. The bowling alley transformed into something between a business and a community center. I started hosting workshops on historic preservation research. Local college students came to interview me for projects about community organizing. Retired teachers volunteered to help other property owners fill out landmark applications correctly. Gary's harassment campaign backfired completely. Every surprise inspection brought more media attention. Every bureaucratic roadblock made the community more determined to support their local hero. His attempts to make my life difficult were actually making me more famous and more effective at helping others. The developers who'd started this whole fight quietly moved on to easier targets. Buildings without historic protection. Neighborhoods without organized communities. Property owners who didn't have manila folders full of homework that could stop bulldozers in their track. The bowling alley didn't just survive the development pressure. It became proof that preparation beats power when communities work together. But the most important lesson was still spreading beyond this one neighborhood. Regular people were learning that they had more control over their communities than they'd ever realized. What started as one woman's refusal to let grief destroy her husband's memory had become a blueprint for fighting back against forces that seemed too big to beat. The manila folder method was spreading like wildfire among people who'd never thought they could stand up to developers and city officials. But something bigger was happening across the entire city. Other property owners were starting to realize they might have more power than they'd ever imagined. The planning office that used to process maybe 3 historic preservation applications per year was suddenly drowning in paperwork. Applications surged during those 6 months. Buildings that developers had already targeted were suddenly filing for protection. What they didn't know was that I had accidentally triggered the biggest community organizing movement the city had seen in decades. Property owners who'd never heard of historic designation were calling the planning office asking for application forms. The clerk who'd barely looked up when I filed my paperwork was now working overtime processing landmark requests. Gary Crane found himself fighting battles on 5 different fronts instead of picking off isolated targets one by one. The corner grocery store that he'd planned to cite for parking violations had filed for historic status the week before his inspection. The family restaurant facing lease pressure had documentation proving it qualified as a community landmark. His intimidation playbook stopped working when people came prepared. Each new application created legal complications that developers hate dealing with. Properties under review for historic designation can't be demolished without federal approval processes that take months or years. Gary's clients were used to quick turnarounds and predictable timelines. This wave of landmark applications was making every project expensive and uncertain. The developers who'd tried to bulldoze my bowling alley were learning a harsh lesson about unintended consequences. Communities that had been quiet and disorganized suddenly knew their rights and weren't afraid to use them. Neighborhood meetings that used to draw maybe 10 people were packed with families asking pointed questions about development plans. Local newspapers started investigating other questionable deals Gary had pushed through in previous years. The reporter who'd covered my victory began digging into his track record with small businesses. How many violations had he found in buildings that coincidentally got demolished for luxury developments? The pattern looked suspicious when you examined it closely. City council meetings transformed from sleepy bureaucratic procedures into packed events where engaged citizens showed up with prepared questions and documented concerns. Residents started demanding transparency about developer proposals and requesting financial records that had never been questioned before. Council members who'd rubber-stamped development approvals for years suddenly faced rooms full of voters who'd done their homework about zoning laws and historic preservation rights. I became the unofficial consultant everyone wanted to meet. My phone rang constantly with calls from nervous property owners facing pressure from developers. I'd spend hours teaching people how to research their buildings, document architectural features, and gather evidence of community significance. The manila folder method was spreading like wildfire through neighborhoods across the city. The lesson I shared was revolutionary in its simplicity. Most people lose these fights because they don't know the rules, not because the rules are unfair. Government systems exist to protect community interests, but only if citizens understand how to use them. The tools were always there. People just didn't know they existed. My research method became a template that worked for different types of buildings and situations. Start with public records at the library or planning office. Document community impact with photos and testimonials. Get an expert to review your evidence before filing. File your application early, before anyone threatens demolition. Those 4 steps could protect almost any building with historical or community significance. The manila folder approach worked because it was systematic and thorough. Instead of panicking when developers showed up with offers or threats, prepared property owners had legal protection already in place. The applications created bureaucratic barriers that made quick demolitions impossible and expensive developments uncertain. One retired lunch lady's quiet preparation had sparked a movement that changed how power worked throughout the entire city. Developers could no longer count on intimidating isolated business owners into quick sales. Communities were organized, informed, and ready to fight back using legal tools they'd learned to navigate. The preservation consultant who'd helped me with my original application started running workshops every Saturday morning at the public library, teaching people how to photograph architectural details correctly, how to research historical significance in city records, how to write community impact statements that government reviewers would take seriously. Gary's reputation took serious damage as his success rate plummeted. Clients started questioning whether he could deliver the quick results they'd paid for. His intimidation tactics looked amateur when property owners responded with organized legal strategies instead of panicked compliance. The whispered conversations at City Hall weren't kind to his professional standing. The economic impact surprised everyone. Buildings with historic designation attracted different kinds of businesses and customers. Heritage tourism brought visitors from other cities. Property values in historic districts increased in ways that benefited longtime residents instead of just developers. Community character became an economic asset instead of an obstacle to profit. Young families moving to the city specifically sought out neighborhoods with protected historic buildings and active community organizations. The areas where my influence had spread became more desirable places to live. Real estate agents started marketing community engagement and historic character as selling points for residential properties. The bowling alley became a training center for community organizing beyond historic preservation. I taught people how to research zoning laws, attend city council meetings effectively, and document code violations properly. The skills transferred to fighting other community issues like traffic problems, school funding, and environmental concerns. What started as one woman's determination to preserve her husband's memory had become a blueprint for community empowerment that was spreading beyond the city limits. Other municipalities started seeing similar waves of historic preservation applications as word spread through social media and local newspaper coverage. The best part was how simple the foundation tools remained. Anyone with access to a public library could research their property's history. Anyone with a camera could document architectural features. Anyone with patience could file government applications correctly. The power wasn't mysterious or complicated once you understood the basic steps. Communities across the region were discovering that they had more control over development decisions than they'd realized. The Manila folder method proved that preparation and patience could beat money and political connections when regular citizens understood how to use the legal tools available to them. But the real lesson went deeper than saving old buildings or stopping bulldozers. It was about what happens when one person decides to do homework that nobody else thinks matters. That homework changed everything for an entire city. My story proves that the secret to beating powerful people isn't fighting harder. It's fighting smarter, with patience and preparation they never see coming. While Gary was planning his demolition timeline, I was building legal armor that would stop bulldozers cold. Here's how you start. 1. Check property records and deeds at your planning office. 2. Save emails and receipts from any interactions. 3. Photograph architectural features and community events. 4. Talk to a preservation expert or local historical society. 5. Get neighbors involved early. These steps are simple but they work. Local rules vary. Start at your planning office or historical society to see what applies where you live. The next time developers show up with bulldozers, you could be better prepared to defend the places that matter. Where are you watching from? What local spot matters to you? Drop a comment and subscribe if you want more stories that turn civic homework into community wins.